Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's video Rejoined, an analysis of the depiction of LGBT in Star Trek. So in this video I will be looking at the representation and the commentary in Star Trek made about the LGBT community, specifically looking at the Deep Space Nine episode Rejoined. Now, this isn't a review for the episode Rejoined because I'm not going to be talking about, well, I will be talking a bit about how good the episode is, but I'm not going to be focused on that. I'm not going to focus on other aspects of the episode like the creation of the new wormhole or Eddington saving Dax's life or stuff like that. I'm focusing specifically on the representation of the LGBT community. And I will also be touching on some other episodes in Star Trek that do touch on this topic as well, and comparing and contrasting that to the way it was done here in the episode Rejoined, but my focus will mainly be on this episode. So the reason why I decided to focus mostly on this episode, because in my humble opinion, this is the best episode of the at least of the first 5 Star Trek series that touches on the issue of same-sex coupling and same-sex relationships and discrimination and stuff like that. There have been other episodes, most notably is The Outcast, which I have already done a review for, and I talked a bit about this in the review for that episode, which I think that episode actually gets the most attention. When people tend to focus on how Star Trek covered the topic of gay and lesbians, they usually go straight to the episode The Outcast, which I think Rejoined is actually a better example of Star Trek tackling this topic, and I don't think it gets as much as attention as it deserves. Perhaps that's because Deep Space Nine was not as popular as The Next Generation, or it just seems to get overlooked, in my opinion. In fact, when I was watching various YouTube videos and reading articles about this, most of them seem to just forget about Rejoin and just focus entirely on The Outcast, which I thought was a bit unfair. So I thought I'd make my own YouTube video to focus more on this video. However, I had been planning on making this video for a while now. And while I was sort of waiting to make it, I did notice that there was another YouTube video that came out that focused entirely on this episode, done by the YouTube channel Matt Baum. So I have to give a shout out to that channel. You should check it out. The video that he did on this episode. So his channel is more focused on analyzing the depiction of the LGBT community in all films and television, and so he did one specifically about this Deep Space Nine episode Rejoin. So I'm not the first to cover this topic, but it is something I still want to cover and give my little take on it as a long-term Star Trek fan. So this is actually quite significant, I reckon, because it wasn't the first lesbian kiss shown on television, but it was one of the first. And in my humble opinion, it was the first that was done in a romantic way that made a commentary about accepting gay and lesbian couples and same-sex couples, and making it more, and making commentary on the discrimination that they face, whereas some of the other same-sex couples kisses that we've seen in the 90s in shows like Roseanne, or I believe there was a couple other sitcoms that those were more of like ploys just to like attract viewers. They didn't really make commentary on the way that same-sex couples are discriminated against and stuff like that. So I think Rejoined was the first one to sort of present it in that sort of light, but it was at least one of the first, and it was very significant in this time period. It aired in 1995. Now, I remember when this episode first came out, there was a disclaimer in the TV guide that said, warning, viewer discretion. Like, there was a viewer discretion warning. And this was the only episode I remember that warning being there for. Like, for example, the Next Generation episode Chain of Command that shows Picard getting tortured, which deals with really heavy subjects of torture, and it was just like really brutal to watch. That didn't come with a viewer discretion disclaimer. And I do believe the viewer discretion disclaimer was actually before the episode aired as well. So when you turned on the channel, it would have this card that would say viewer discretion before the episode aired. Again, they didn't do that for Chain of Command. They didn't do that for the episode Tribunal on Deep Space Nine, where Brian was tortured a bit. And other episodes of Deep Space Nine have featured really adult themes like Duet, which deals with genocide and mass murdering. None of that comes with viewer disclaimers, but this episode did, just because it had two women kissing. So that actually, I think, speaks a lot to the time frame of the 90s. Now, me personally, I think this wasn't that big of a deal for me, because I think I lived in a little bubble, because I lived in a very sort of liberal area on the East Coast of America, and so accepting same-sex couples as normal was it was just a normal thing. We didn't really make that big of a deal out of it. But I didn't realize at the time that I was in this little bubble, because outside, apparently, in some TV stations in the South, outright refused to show this episode, which is quite surprising to me. So I wasn't really aware. And plus, watching a lot of commentary and videos now, like Matt Baum's videos, for example, they bring up the fact that how unacceptable it was to present same-sex couples in the public, and on TV or films like that. And I wasn't actually, I didn't know that at the time, but looking back on it, a lot of people saying the 90s were actually very discriminatory towards same-sex couples, especially compared to recent times, which, again, at the time I was oblivious to this because I lived in my little bubble where it was seen as acceptable. In fact, I remember showing this episode to a friend of mine who was bisexual, and she really appreciated this episode and thought that it made really great commentary, and it was good to get this sort of things out there. Yeah, so, and one thing I often remembered is I remember reading about there was a lot of people who were apparently upset when this episode aired, and they got a lot of angry letters, a lot of angry phone calls, and I remember reading about the one phone call in particular, which I always remember, where someone was complaining that they showed this, that, hey, I watched this show with my kids, and what are you doing showing two women kiss? And the person on the phone was like, well, would it have been more acceptable if the woman took out a phaser and shot and killed the other woman? Would that have been okay? And the guy was like, yeah, sure. And so the person was like, all right, well, maybe you need to re-examine your priorities here, not us. And I think that's absolutely great. That's totally right. But I guess it just goes to show the cultural mindset. Now, let me get more into why I like this episode so much, and why I think it's sort of Star Trek at its best, making commentary on LGBT relations. Because I've heard some people actually try to say that this episode wasn't really about that even though it featured two women kissing, it's not really about the gay community or the discrimination that they face, which I totally and completely disagree with. I think if you analyze this episode, look at it, it's the whole thing, similar to The Outcast, is shaped around making commentary about the discrimination that the LGBT community face. So I think it's unfair to, I've seen some other people shove this episode aside and put it in the same category as episodes like The Host, which barely touch on this subject, whereas I think the entire episode of Rejoined is about this subject. And frankly, I think it does a much better job at making this commentary than The Outcast did, which is part of the reason why I think it should get more attention than it does. But anyway, and one of the main differences, of course, the obvious main difference in Rejoined is that it actually does feature a same-sex couple. and it has the same-sex couple kiss, whereas the Outcast doesn't. And this is something Jonathan Frakes, who plays Commander Riker, was very critical about in that episode, because he saw that the episode was a commentary about gay discrimination, and yet it had the actor that he was kissing was played by a female actor, so it is actually a male-female relationship. So Jonathan Frakes insisted that the actor should have been played by a male, but the studio wouldn't go for it. And I actually can see the studio's perspective on that, because in that particular episode of The Outcast, it was about a androgynous race of aliens that didn't have gender, but this one particular person identified as a female. So it kind of makes sense to have that actor played by a female actor, because that character identifies as a female, which is why I kind of don't think that episode works as much. But in here, you actually have a same-sex couple, but of course that's not what the issue is about. But that's actually, and I've seen some in the gay community push back against this, because they see it as kind of a cop-out that they're making an analogy, because they don't outright mention that they're a gay couple. Instead, they focus on the taboo having to do with the Trill. Now, if you need a refresher for this episode, so basically in this episode, Jadzia Dax meets up with another Trill, Lenara Khan. And so if you know the thing about Trills, they have, the joined species as the symbiont that joins with the host, and they become a different individual with each host, and the symbionts move from host to host after, the hosts live out their lives and die. So the symbiont that Jadzia has, Dax, used to be and a host named Tarius, who was a male, and he was married to the Khan symbiont used to be in the person that Tarius was married to, but then the Khan symbiont is now in Lenara. So basically, they used to be male and female a couple lifetimes ago, and they meet again. And what's interesting about this is that Tarius died in the shuttle accident. So it's not like they got divorced. They didn't die of old age. They were like in the middle of like the heart of their marriage, of their relationship, and it ended like abruptly. And now, so decades later, or centuries later maybe, I'm not sure, when they're in two totally different bodies, they meet up again, and they are still in love. They still have that connection, and it mostly had to do with the connection that they felt. Now, I know where the complaints come from is because this isn't a one-to-one analogy with the troubles that the LGBT community faces, because there's a lot of different aspects to it, such as reconnecting with an ex or stuff like that, and just the weird way that the Trills reassociate and stuff like that sort of makes it a bit different. But however, I think at the heart of the episode, it's about the forbidden love, the taboo love, and that's where I think the analogies to the LGBT community, something that's looked down on society, because that's the main thing about this episode, is that Trill society looks down on symbionts reconnecting with someone they knew in a past life. That's seen as a no-no, because symbionts are supposed to live different lives, and the whole point of moving the host is to live totally different lives, so that they see reconnecting with someone from a past life as not experiencing more, and so it's really looked down upon and seen as a taboo, as they say. But this episode presents it a bit more than just a taboo, because there's the actual really real consequence of reconnecting with someone from a previous life is apparently being banished from Trill society, which means that the symbiont will not be able to get a new host. So once the host dies, then the symbiont dies too. It can't live on. So it's like really dire consequences, and that's what's really looming over this episode. Now, again, it's not a one-to-one analogy, but it's very obvious what they're going for here is that the concept of forbidden love, of society being against saying these two people should not be together, society is fighting, pushing back against this, regardless of how these two people feel about each other. Now, I have heard the opinion that some people actually agreed with the notion of this policy, of the general feelings behind it, that symbionts should move on. They shouldn't just reconnect with old people and other people from other lives, because it would present more problems, and it's a growth issue. And I think that's kind of beside the point. I don't think the point is whether or not you agree with this specific. And again, that's why some people say it's not a really good analogy for the LGBT community. But I think it's beside the point of whether or not you agree with the Trill's specific rule in this regard, or their thinking of why they have this rule. The fact is, they have a policy that outcasts, basically, kills the symbiont just for a love that they don't agree with. And that's where the analogy comes in, because that's actually wrong. Whether you agree that Trill shouldn't reassociate with previous hosts is not the point. The point is the consequences, the taboo is not fair, that people should be able to love who they want to love without society fighting against that. And so you get a lot of scenes where Lenara's brother and the guy she works with, the scientist she works with, being very disapproving, disappointing. They're if they see Jadzia and Lenara together, they get very upset and how dare you can't. And this is a clear analogy to the discrimination the LGBT community faces, because family members who may not necessarily be against their brother or sister being gay, maybe they don't care, they're okay with them being gay, they're just worried about the consequences that they face because of society. And this is something the gay community had to put up with for centuries, particularly in this past century. It's only changed very recently, where the consequences of coming out for being gay would mean you could lose your career, you could lose your job, your livelihood, you could be discredited, you wouldn't be able to be a politician or a lawyer. It could be, especially if you're a teacher, it could totally ruin your lifestyle. And so you would have family members who would be concerned, say, don't go into a same-sex relationship, not because they're against that person being gay, but because they're against the consequences of the way society looks down on doing this kind of behavior. And in that way, I think the analogy really shines. It really works. And plus, you get Cisco's perspective, which I love the scene with Jadzia, Dax, and Cisco, where Jadzia is saying that she wants to resume the relationship with Lenar. And Cisco, at first, is warning against the consequences and saying, look, I'm just being a friend, that I'm telling you this is the real life consequences of Trill society. Whether you agree with their taboo or not, this is what the consequences are going to be. But when Jadzia insists, I love her and I'm willing to face the consequences, Benjamin Sisko's I'll back you all the way. If that's what you want to do, if your love is that important to you, I will back. And that was such a great moment. That was such a great scene, because it showed the kind of friendship and the kind of friend who is willing to look beyond this taboo and willing to say that, look, if that's who you want to love, you should be able to love who you want to love. So that's part of what makes, and that was just such a great scene too. It showed the friendship that Benjamin and Jadzia had, and how strong that was. But one thing about this episode, I think, makes it stand apart from the Outcast. And of course, the main thing is that it actually has a same-sex couple. But it's also the way that it presents the future as them being nonchalant about same-sex couples. They don't care. Nobody ever brings up the fact that Lenar and Dax are the same sex. And again, some in the LGBT community see it as a cop-out, because it's tackling the issue of gay discrimination without mentioning gays at all, but at least it shows a same-sex couple. And plus, actually, in some ways, I think it's better because the whole point of Star Trek is to show a future where humanity and society has moved beyond all the discriminations that we currently face, such as, say, racial discrimination, because the original series had people of many different races, backgrounds, and genders serving on the bridge, which was seen as unheard of in the 1960s. But the original series still tackled issues of race discrimination, but it did it through the use of analogy. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. So I think there's also nothing wrong with Deep Space Nine doing the same thing, where it shows a future where people don't care anymore if they don't make a big deal out of same-sex couple. It's normal. And this is made very clear in this episode, because when Jadzia first mentions Lenore and then they bring up the taboo of Trill society, other people around them, like Quark and Kira and Bashir, are just like, why don't you just resume the relationship? What's the big deal? It's like they don't even acknowledge the fact that they're the same sex because it doesn't make a difference. Because in this advanced society, they don't point out things like same-sex coupling or discriminate against that or saying, oh, it's unnatural, whatever. It is natural. It's normal. And that is something that society is actually moving towards in modern times. So I think it's actually a great statement. The fact that this episode does present same-sex coupling as nothing to be all weird and unnormal or natural about it. It's just something that's natural, and nobody even sees it as abnormal. Now, the one thing I think hurts that representation in this episode is the fact that we never see any same-sex couples in Star Trek prior to this. So that kind of doesn't really make sense that people will be so nonchalant about same-sex couples if there are no same-sex couples. Now, in Next Generation, there was a noted episode, they did try to have a same-sex couple, two men, just be in the background and have like a subplot of them in a Next Generation episode, but that episode was never made because there was a lot of pushback from the studios, and just didn't think that society was ready to see a couple of two men on TV, which it does speak very poorly of that time, because Star Trek has always pushed the boundaries and done things that society wasn't ready for. So the fact that they weren't willing to do that and instead came up with this episode, The Outcast, which actually has just a male and female couple, that I can see why the gay community would be upset about that, because they're copping out. Rather than actually showing two men together, they show a man and a female, but making an analogy to the gay community. So I can see how that could just be seen as cowardly and a cop-out. But here at least they do show a same-sex couple, but they should show it a lot more. Now, you could argue that chronologically, you could look back on things like Discovery, which just came out recently, that has a gay couple, and then everyone's nonchalant about it. So in the timeline, you could say that's why it's further established that people are nonchalant about same-sex couples in this Star Trek future. But in the time that this episode came out, it was like, well, if it's not such a big deal, why don't we see more same-sex couples? And of course, the reason is, of course, that studio went a lot, and a lot of people, as I said, like networks, whole associates in the South refused to show the episode, and people were complaining. So it does illustrate that the discrimination against the LGBT community was a huge issue even in the 90s, more so than I was aware of living in my little bubble. Anyway, there's also other parts of, although I say we don't see like same-sex couples in Star Trek, there are other episodes of Deep Space Nine that they kind of skirt this, and as I said, I don't blame them. This is like, there's a lot of studio and network pushback. They did the best they could, but there's like a subtle little hint that I really liked in the second season episode, Rules of Acquisition, In that episode, it was about a Ferengi female pretending to be male because females weren't allowed to leave the home world. They weren't allowed to wear clothes, and they weren't allowed to earn profit, which is what Ferengis are all about. So this Ferengi female, Pell, pretends to be a male, or poses as a male, so puts on the fake lobes and everything, so she can go out and earn profit. But in doing so, she ends up falling in love with Quark. Now, what's interesting is that 2 times in this episode, people have pointed out, or that they could tell that Pell is in love with Quark. Like Jadzia, for example, she can pick up on this immediately, and so she goes to Pell and it's like, oh, so you're in love with Quark. But the thing is that, and when she says that, she's not aware that Pell is a female, so she's assuming that he's that she's a male, and that it's a same-sex couple. And again, it's completely normal to her. She's like, oh, so you're in love with Quark, and she's like, oh, he doesn't even know I'm a woman. And she's like, what, you're a woman? So she was thinking that there was just a man in love with another man, and she was perfectly okay and natural with this, and saying, oh, why don't you tell him? And eventually Pell does kiss Quark and come on to him, but that's before Quark is aware that she's a woman. So at this point, Quark thinks that Pell is a male and that this other man has a crush on him. And it makes him very nervous. He doesn't know what to deal with it. Now, in that case, I think it would have been, I think in character for the Ferengi for him to be discriminatory towards gays, because the Ferengi are shown as particularly backwards. As I said, they don't let women wear clothes or leave the home house or earn profit. So they're very backward society, and they're sort of an analogy to some of the worst aspects of modern day society, having to do with greed or discrimination or whatnot. So I think but they didn't really touch on this that much in this episode. And Quark himself is seen as kind of a good guy, so I can see why they didn't want to show him as too discriminatory. But you could tell it made him very uncomfortable. But if they would played off that more, that if they portrayed the Ferengi as being discriminating towards gays, I think that actually would make sense in the character of the Ferengi, because they're shown as being backwards and not what you want to be, like unlike the Federation, which is shown as what you do want to be. So it's contrasted by Jadzia saying, oh, not caring about it. And then there's also the introduction of Garrick in the 2nd episode of the series, which the episode title is eluding me at the moment. But in that episode, Garrick meets Bashir, and he introduces himself as plain simple Garrick. And I always thought that it seemed like he was coming on to Bashir in that episode. And apparently, I read about this much later, that the actor Andrew Robinson was in fact playing it exactly like that. He was playing it, in his mind, he thought of Garrick as pansexual. And so he thought that Garrick was indeed coming on to Bashir. But in the future, when Garrick makes future appearances, he never acts like that anymore. I think the producers specifically told Andrew Robinson not to play it up like that anymore, because I think they didn't want that for that character. And I do think that is kind of a shame that they left that aside. But it does show that they did have sort of more representation like that in Deep Space Nine, and making it clear that being homosexual was not a huge deal, not something that was discriminated against in this perfect future. And so, getting back to like the love aspect of this episode, because when I say that this episode is better than The Outcast, and part of that also has to do with, well, I think it's just a better episode, first of all. I remember when this episode first came out, I liked it a lot. Sometimes they even put it on my top 20 list. I remember someone once saying to me, oh, the only reason you like this episode is because it has 2 women kissing. And I'm like, no, actually, if it was a man and woman kissing, and even if it was 2 men kissing, I would like this episode just as much because it has that same. It's the story itself really works, as it has a powerful story that anyone can connect to, that I could relate to myself, about a forbidden love, about people being denied certain love, and a societal issues pushing against us. So it's not just about the LGBT community. I think the way that the relationship is presented is relatable to everyone, which is, I think, makes it more powerful in its message about the LGBT community, because if it presents something, the plight that this community faces, but presents it in a way that's relatable to everyone, it makes it more powerful. I reckon that's something The Outcast didn't do, because The Outcast was specifically looking at it from that way. And plus, major difference between this episode and The Outcast is it wasn't that good episode, really. If you leave aside the commentary the commentary for homosexuality is actually the only good thing about that episode. If you leave that aside, the episode is rather dull and boring, whereas I think this episode itself, as I said, it features some great scenes between Jadzia and Cisco, and just the way the romance is played between Jadzia and Leonard is very powerful. Particularly the kiss scene, where I think it was expertly directed, and this episode was directed by Avery Brooks, who I have some issues with his acting, but he's actually a really good director. And you can tell how well this scene was directed, because it really comes across that these two women are trying to fight their passion. They're trying to fight the love that they feel from each other. And you actually see it physically starting to manifest. And just the whole way it was filmed was absolutely brilliant. Which really sets it apart from The Outcast, because in The Outcast they didn't buy the romance between Riker and Janelle at all. The two of them had no chemistry. It felt very forced. It felt like a lot of telling, not showing, with Riker saying, "Oh, I'm in love with her," but you don't actually feel the connection the way that you actually feel it in this episode, which I think also makes it a lot more powerful. And plus it focuses more, whereas The Outcast focused more on the discrimination aspect of it, where in that case it was kind of a lame analogy to gay conversion therapy, which is total BS. And I talked about in my review of The Outcast how this analogy doesn't really work. But it focused more on them being hunted and persecuted, whereas in this episode, it focuses more on the taboo aspect of being in love, of having a romance and love that society sees as wrong. And again, as I talked about before, about how the family members don't care about them being gay, they just don't like the fact, they just don't want to see them discriminated or face consequences from society because of this fact, and so that's why they push them not to be gay. So that, I think, is a more relatable and more powerful commentary, and the way it was executed was a hell of a lot better. So yeah, and also there's the Enterprise episode Stigma that some people bring up. That's, I think, is more of a direct analogy to AIDS, HIV, not necessarily the gay community, although it does touch on, because that discrimination against people with AIDS, HIV was directly linked to discrimination against homosexuals, because the having HIV or AIDS was seen as, oh well, you must be gay, then that's why people discriminate against, because they disapprove of that behavior. So the episode Stigma in Enterprise was about T'Pol contracting this disease because she did a mind meld, and Vulcans in this era looked very poorly on mind meld. They think people who did mind melds were like the riffraffs of society, and they didn't like them. So when they found out T'Pol had this disease, they just, instead of helping her, they just used it to discredit her, try to ruin her career, because how dare she this proves that she mind melded before. And it's that was I like the analogy. It was a decent attempt to make commentary on a very relevant and powerful issue. But again, I feel about this episode kind of similar to the way I feel about The Outcast, is that it's not a good episode. Plus, I'm not going to get too much into the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, but it just irritates me because the Vulcans, I don't like the way the Vulcans were presented in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, as they were presented as basically dicks. They were assholes. And this episode, they're probably at their worst. And so that's why I don't think this episode really works, because the Vulcans are so out of character in this episode to discriminate against someone for mind melding. And Archer even points out to them, is like, look, you call yourself enlightened, but you're discriminating against something that you don't like. And again, and that's a good analogy for common times for people in the 80s or 90s who discriminated against those with HIV, and they called themselves enlightened, but really they weren't. But I think the reason why this analogy doesn't work as well for me is because they're forcing the analogy into a Star Trek situation where it doesn't really fit. So, in other words, the Vulcans are having to act totally out of character in order for this analogy to fit in, which irritates me. And again, the whole first 2 seasons of Enterprise annoy me. So, I'm not going to get... So, to me, that's not really a good example of Star Trek making commentary on the LGBT community either. But it's okay. Like, nice try. A for effort. Whatever. But, now let me talk about another thing that some people may hold against Rejoined, against this episode in particular, is because some people may see it as kind of, because I mentioned before there were other shows like Roseanne and a few others that presented 2 women kissing, but it was a way to attract ratings because, ooh, look at this, it's girl on girl action, it's hot. And you could say it's actually more acceptable to see 2 women kissing than 2 men kissing, because it is seen as to many men as arousing. Like, there's a whole porn genre about it, and I've actually seen comments from people who are very discriminating against the LGBT community, who was very much against gay marriage and stuff like that, who admitted to liking watching lesbian porn. So to simply show 2 women kissing doesn't necessarily, I mean, people could still discriminate against the LGBT community and have 2 women kissing. And of course, Terry Farrell, who plays Jadzia Dax, the whole reason she was hired in the first place, we're being completely honest and frank, is because she's hot. And that's the whole main reason. And they changed the makeup of the Trill, because originally the Trill had like this little thing on their forehead, but they're like, no, take that away. You can't see how hot she is. It takes away from her hotness. So let's put these dots on her neck instead. So one of the pushbacks, some criticism people might make on this episode, is that it is playing on that aspect by having 2 attractive women kissing. It's trying to make it more appealing to men. And yes and no. I mean, I can definitely see that perspective. It's definitely a factor. But again, the context is an important thing. To quote an episode of Discovery, context is for kings. So the context in this case is that the context of the episode is that there's a romance. It's that they're in love with each other, and you really get that. Again, really well acted, really well directed. You feel the traction, the romance between these 2 people, and unlike the Outcast, and you buy this love that holds between them. So it's focusing more on the romantic aspect rather than the sexual aspect of it, if that makes any sense. Unlike those other shows like Roseanne or whatever, which focus mainly on the sexual attraction aspect of it. So I think the context sort of puts that in a more positive light. Now, do I think it was a bit of a cop-out for them to have that they wouldn't be able to do this with 2 men, because that wouldn't be seen as socially as acceptable? Yeah, I definitely do think that is a factor. And that's why in recent times in Star Trek Discovery, where they had a male-male couple and they had a male-male kiss on Discovery, that was a big deal. Now, I've heard some people trying to downplay this as a big deal. In fact, I saw a video from the Red Letter Media where they played, where they showed the two men kissing in Discovery, and it's like, oh, that's the first gay, same-sex couple kiss, and then they showed a clip from Emperor's New Cloak that had Ezra kissing Kira, and be like, oh, it's not. But it's the first male-male kiss, and I think that's important. I don't think that's something to downplay. I think that is significant because it is, like it or not, more socially acceptable to show two women kissing on TV than it was to show two men kissing on TV. In fact, I don't think they would have been able to get away with that in the 90s. So I do think it's actually really significant for Discovery to have a male-male couple and to show two men kissing. I do think that was a milestone in the Star Trek franchise, and not something to balk at just because they had two women kissing before Deep Space Nine. Again, it is also a milestone for Deep Space Nine for Rejoined to show two women kissing, especially in the way that they did. But it's another milestone for Discovery. It's not saying, oh, they're just doing something Deep Space Nine already did. No, they're not. It's also important to show two men kissing, just as it was to show two women kissing. Now, Emperor's New Cloak is another thing I gotta touch on, because I actually think that was, first of all, Red Letter Media for saying, oh, here's using that as an example of two women kissing. Again, that wasn't the first example. Rejoined was the first example, but they didn't say, to be fair to them, they didn't say it was the first example. They just said it was a prior example. Okay, whatever. But I still think that's a bad example, because in that episode, again, that is a bad episode. And in that episode, I do think the same-sex kisses that we got, or the same-sex implications and couples we got in that episode, did seem strictly for sex appeal. That, especially the Kira and Ezra kiss in particular, that does seem all about more sexual attraction than it did about the romance aspect or the discrimination that the LGBT community faces aspect that you see in Rejoined. So that's why I think that is not a very good example. And also, like, having is kind of a cop-out too to have it in the mirror universe, because the mirror universe is almost a bad thing. It's almost could be seen as discriminatory towards the LGBT community, because the mirror universe is seen as something that's evil or twisted or bad. So by showing has homosexuality has sort of normal and acceptable there, and just happens all the time, actually has negative connotations, because it's the mirror universe where the mirror universe is fucked up. So it's kind of saying, oh, look at how fucked up they are. They even have women kissing each other. Although that's probably a really cynical way of looking at it. But regardless, I don't think Emperor's New Cloak is a very good example. And it's a bad episode overall, just even beyond that. So let's not even get into that. Anyway, so I think that, yes, that's pretty much all I have to say on this particular topic. Overall, I just think that Rejoined is a great episode. And again, I'm not considering this my review for the episode of Rejoined. So sometime in the future, if it comes up, someone requests that I review Rejoined, I will do another review of this episode where I'll get more into the episode itself, some of the other aspects of it, how well acted, how well directed it was, how great the romance is. This is one of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine, to be honest. Maybe not top 20, but it's definitely, I think, a very good episode of Deep Space Nine. And I think it's a very good commentary on LGBT, and I think it was a very important step, much more so than the Outcast. I'm a bit, just a bit grumpy about the fact that the Outcast gets more attention than this episode, because I think this episode does deserve a lot more attention. Although, to be fair, it does have some faults, and there are some complaints from the LGBT community that this episode kind of cops out in certain places, and I do think that's fair. But I think it did the best that it could in the 90s. And I do think it was, even if it could have done better, it was still important. It was still vital. I think it was an important step for the Star Trek franchise, and had implications beyond the Star Trek franchise. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this. You can check out my channel as I cover many more videos on Star Trek. I also cover other shows like Game of Thrones, Lost, and The Expanse. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.